The NAEG framework is comprised of two distinct parts. First, the observations. First of which is that standardization necessarily sacrifices individuation in exchange for systemization, whereas the alternative, or the opposite of standardization, necessarily prioritizes individuation over systemization. So, if the athletes win the round, they need merely show that standardization is preferable to individuation in education, and that the NAEG needs to win the round. They need to simply show that individuation is preferable in education to standardization. The reasoning behind this is twofold. First of all, to standardize is to make it such that you can compare between disparate individuals along the same vector, which is to say those two schools are now comparable, whereas with letter grades they're not, because that depends entirely on the individual teacher. With standardized testing, now you can compare this school with this school. That's the principle behind standardization, therefore it's the diminishment of individuation. The second warrant behind it is that to argue that standardized testing is merely a component within education misses the whole point. Standardized testing defines the success criterion for the school, for the teacher, for the district, for the superintendent. So obviously it's going to define what success is. And therefore, if a teacher is a good teacher but does bad on a standardized test, well, they're not a good teacher at all, because whether or not you're a good teacher is defined by how well you do on the standardized test. So, as a consequence, standardized testing is standardized education. Now on to the card part of the framework. The first card of the framework is the Ryan A card, and it's about self-determination theory. Self-determination theory tells us specifically that implicit and explicit motivation relate to the actual, are two different kinds of motivation. And that explicit motivation, the threat of punishment or the promise of reward in exchange for a given behavior, diminishes actual motivation or implicit motivation in all circumstances. So that we know now that by making the ability to get into a good college contingent on a standardized test, we make it less likely that a student is going to be motivated to do well on that test. In other words, the more importance we place on the test, the more reward or punishment we place around the test, the less likely a student is to do it for the right reasons. Now, this Ryan A card has a second part, which is our second part of our framework, which shows that as human beings, our job is to do two things. It's to optimize social environments, and it's to do so for the purpose of maximizing actualization. This is, of course, most important in education, where we're dealing with the future adult humans that will run the society and be a part of our society. We're dealing with our children, and as any parent knows, a parent has nothing more precious in their life to them than their own child. I'm a parent myself, I know this. And as a consequence, it's very important that we do that thing right. And our evidence and our case is all about showing you that standardization is, at its core, doing that wrong. It's crushing the individual identity of each of these students in exchange for an ability for some bureaucrat to better compare different schools in different districts. We say that's wrong, we say it's ineffective, and we don't like it. And so our framework is, judge, whoever shows that either standardization over individuation is better, then they win. If we show individuation over standardization is better, we win. It's a fair framework. It's not an alternative we're presenting. It's implicit to the definition of standardization. And we strongly urge you to prefer our framework. It's a 4-minute framework speech.